The gunshot that killed her father echoed through the canyon like a church bell, tolling the end of everything Sarah Hawkins had ever known. And as she stood over his fresh grave in the hard Arizona Territory soil of 1878, she realized she could not even carve his name into the wooden cross, because nobody had ever taught her how to write. Sarah was 22 years old, alone in a world that devoured women like her without mercy, and the only thing she owned besides the faded calico dress on her back was the small cattle ranch her father had built with his own 2 hands over 15 brutal years. The ranch sat in a valley 30 miles outside of Prescott, surrounded by red rock formations that glowed like embers at sunset. And now it was hers along with 12 head of cattle, 2 horses, and a mortgage she had no idea how to read, let alone pay. She spent the first 3 days after the burial trying to make sense of the papers the bank man had brought out, spreading them across the rough-hewn table in the cabin while tears of frustration blurred her vision. The black marks on the cream-colored paper might as well have been chicken scratches for all the meaning they held. Her father had promised to teach her letters someday, always someday. But someday never came, and now he was in the ground with a bullet hole in his chest courtesy of a cattle rustler who had gotten away clean. On the 4th day, Sarah was attempting to fix the fence on the north pasture when she saw the rider coming up the trail. The sun was directly overhead, turning the desert into a furnace, and heat waves made the approaching figure shimmer like a mirage. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and reached for the rifle leaning against the fence post, because out here, you did not take chances with strangers. The rider was a man on a paint horse, and as he drew closer she could see he was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face that the sun had bronzed to the color of saddle leather. He wore the typical gear of a working cowboy: worn denim trousers, a blue shirt faded nearly white from washing, leather chaps scarred from mesquite thorns, and a hat with a brim shaped by weather and time. A Colt revolver rode low on his hip, but his hands were nowhere near it as he approached. "Afternoon, miss," he called out when he was still 20 feet away, respectful enough to announce himself. "Name is Daniel Mackenzie. I heard in town there might be work out this way." Sarah kept the rifle pointed downward, but her fingers stayed near the trigger. "Who told you that?" "Man at the general store. Said old Jim Hawkins ran cattle out here and might need a hand." Daniel's eyes, she noticed, were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage after a rain. "I did not hear about his passing until just now, seeing that grave marker up on the hill." "I am real sorry for your loss, miss." "It is Mrs. Hawkins," Sarah lied automatically, because sometimes a fictional husband was the only protection a woman had. But then she realized how foolish that was when she was standing here alone in the middle of nowhere, and she corrected herself. "Actually, it is Miss Sarah Hawkins, and my father was Jim." Daniel nodded slowly, taking in the information along with the sight of the rundown ranch, the sagging fence, the water trough that needed cleaning, and the barn door hanging crooked on its hinges. "Looks like you could use a hand regardless. I am a fair worker, miss. I can mend fence, break horses, doctor cattle, and I know which end of a cow gets up first. I will work for $30 a month, food, and a place in the barn to spread my bedroll." $30 was more than fair. It was cheap, actually, and Sarah suspected he could see her desperation as clearly as she could see the honest fatigue in his face that spoke of a man who had been riding from ranch to ranch looking for work in a territory where jobs were scarce. But she had no $30. She had no money at all except for a small tin with maybe $8 in coins, and that had to buy flour and coffee and ammunition. "I cannot pay you," she admitted, hating how her voice cracked on the words. "Not in money, anyway. I can feed you, and you can have the barn, but I do not even know if I can keep this place past the end of the month. The bank wants money I do not have." Daniel dismounted, and Sarah noticed he moved with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. He was taller than she had thought, lean and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "How much does the bank want?" "I do not know," Sarah said, and then the whole miserable truth came spilling out in a rush. "I cannot read the papers, I never learned letters. My father meant to teach me, but we were always too busy with the ranch work. And then it was too late, and now he is dead, and I am going to lose everything because I am too ignorant to even know what I am signing when they put papers in front of me." The admission hung in the hot air between them, shameful and raw. Sarah waited for the judgment, for the condescension, for the smirk that would tell her this stranger thought her pathetic. But Daniel just studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Being unable to read does not make you ignorant, Miss Hawkins," he said finally. "It just means nobody taught you yet. There is a difference." He gestured toward the cabin. "Why don't you show me those papers? I can read well enough." "My mother was a schoolteacher back in Missouri before she married my father. She made sure all her children knew their letters." Sarah hesitated. Trusting a stranger with her financial troubles seemed like inviting disaster, but what choice did she have? She was drowning, and this man was offering a rope. She nodded and led him toward the cabin, acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the sound of his boots on the hard-packed earth and the jingle of his spurs. Inside the cabin, which was just 2 rooms connected by a breezeway, Sarah pointed to the table where the papers lay scattered. Daniel removed his hat, revealing hair damp with sweat, and sat down to examine the documents. Sarah stood nearby, her arms crossed over her chest, feeling vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. Daniel was quiet for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read through the mortgage papers, loan agreements, and a recent letter from the Prescott Territorial Bank. Finally, he sat back and let out a low whistle. "All right, here is the situation," he said, looking up at her with those serious gray-green eyes. "Your father took out a loan 3 years ago for $500 to buy more cattle and make improvements on the ranch. He has been making payments, but he is behind by 3 months. The bank wants $150 by the end of this month, which is," he calculated quickly, "23 days from now. If you cannot pay, they will foreclose and sell the ranch to cover the debt. $150 might as well have been $150,000. Sarah sank into the other chair, feeling the weight of impossibility crushing down on her. "I do not have it. I do not have any way to get it. How many cattle do you have?" 12 head. "But they are all we have for breeding stock. If I sell them, there is no ranch anyway." Daniel nodded, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. "What about horses?" 2, one is ancient, the other is only half broke. "Can you cook?" The question surprised her. "What? Can you cook? So, do laundry?" "Of course I can," Sarah said, bristling slightly. "What woman cannot?" "Then we might have a way forward," Daniel said, leaning forward with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Here is what I am thinking. I will work for you for free, no pay at all, in exchange for food in the barn. Together, we can round up wild horses from the canyon country north of here. There are still decent Mustang herds if you know where to look. We catch and break them, then drive them to Fort Whipple. The Army is always looking for sound horses, and they pay fair. Meanwhile, you can take in laundry from the miners in Prescott, maybe do some sewing. It will not be easy, but if we both work ourselves to the bone for the next 3 weeks, we might just scrape together enough to save your ranch." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. "Why would you do this? Why would you work for nothing to help a stranger?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where the late afternoon light was painting the canyon walls gold and crimson. "5 years ago, I had a little place of my own up in Colorado," he said softly. "Not much, just a small spread with a few horses. I got sick, real sick with fever, was laid up for 2 months. Could not work, could not make my payments. By the time I recovered, the bank had taken everything. If someone had helped me then, just given me a hand when I needed it most, my whole life would be different. I have been drifting ever since, working other people's ranches, sleeping in other people's barns. So maybe I am helping you because I wish someone had helped me. Or maybe I just do not like seeing banks take what people have built with their own sweat and blood." There was a pain in his voice that Sarah recognized because she carried the same pain now. Loss. Displacement. The particular grief of having your roots torn up. She made her decision in that moment based on nothing more than instinct and desperation and the honest look in this stranger's eyes. "All right," she said, extending her hand across the table. "We have a deal, Mr. Mackenzie." His hand engulfed hers, calloused palm against calloused palm, and when he smiled for the first time, Sarah felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with business arrangements. "Call me Daniel," he said. "If we are going to save your ranch, we might as well be on a first-name basis." They started the next morning before dawn. Daniel proved to be as good as his word, working with a focused intensity that Sarah had to scramble to match. He spent the first day making repairs to the ranch, fixing the barn door, mending fence, cleaning the water troughs, and tending to the cattle while Sarah rode into Prescott with a sign she had made Daniel write for her. "Laundry and mending. Fair prices. Inquire at Hawkins Ranch." Prescott was a rough town, growing fast thanks to the mining operations in the surrounding hills, and it was full of men who would pay good money not to wash their own clothes. Sarah came home that evening with promises of work from 3 different boarding houses and a pile of shirts from a mining foreman who wanted them mended by the end of the week. That night, after a supper of beans and cornbread, Sarah sat at the table with needle and thread while Daniel tended to his horse. When he came back inside, he found her squinting in the lamplight, her fingers moving with quick efficiency as she repaired a torn seam. "You are good at that," he observed, pulling out the other chair. "My mother taught me before she died. I was 10. Sarah bit off the thread and reached for another shirt. "It is about the only thing she had time to teach me before the fever took her." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then he stood and retrieved a piece of paper and a pencil from his saddlebag. He sat back down and smoothed the paper on the table between them. "My mother taught me letters," he said. "Seems only fair I pass that on, if you want to learn, that is." Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. She looked at the blank paper, at the pencil, at Daniel's patient expression. "Now? Why not now? You are going to be up late sewing anyway. Might as well learn something while you work." He picked up the pencil and carefully drew a large letter at the top of the page. "This is an A. It is the first letter of the alphabet and the first letter of America, Arizona, and a whole lot of other important words." Sarah leaned closer, studying the simple shape. "It looked like a little house with a crossbeam. That is an A. That is an A. Here, you try." He handed her the pencil. Her first attempt was shaky, the lines uneven and uncertain. Daniel did not laugh or criticize. He just guided her hand gently, showing her the angle of the lines, the way the crossbeam connected them. His hand was warm over hers, and Sarah found herself acutely aware of his nearness, the smell of horse and leather and honest sweat that clung to him. "There," he said as she completed a passable A. "That is good. That is real good for a first try." They worked for an hour that night, Daniel drawing letters and Sarah copying them while her fingers continued their sewing work almost automatically. A, B, C, D. Each letter was a small revelation, a key to a locked world. By the time exhaustion forced them both to bed, Sarah could write the first 5 letters of the alphabet, and something had shifted between them. Some barrier had fallen away in the intimate quiet of the lesson. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Before dawn, they would drink coffee and eat whatever quick breakfast Sarah could prepare. Then Daniel would saddle both horses and they would ride out together. He taught her to track the wild Mustang herds, to read the signs in the desert, to move quietly and patiently. The Mustangs were wary, half-wild descendants of Spanish horses, and catching them required skill and strategy. Daniel built a trap corral in a narrow canyon where he had seen the horses watering, using the natural rock walls and adding rails and rope to create a funnel. Then came the waiting, The patient hours of letting the horses grow accustomed to the presence of the corral, of leaving water and a salt lick inside to lure them in. While they waited, they worked on everything else. Sarah took in more and more laundry, her hands growing raw from washing in lye soap. She sewed until her eyes burned, repairing clothes and making simple dresses for the women in town. Every cent went into the tin that would hopefully, eventually, contain enough to pay the bank. And every night after supper, Daniel taught her letters. "This is an S," he said one evening about a week into their partnership. "S for Sarah. That is your letter, the beginning of your name." Sarah traced the curving line, fascinated by its snake-like shape. "How many letters are in my name?" 5, S-A-R-H. He wrote it out for her in large, clear script. "Sarah Hawkins, that is you in letters." She stared at her name, emotion tightening her throat. There she was, reduced to simple marks on paper, yet somehow more real than she had ever felt before. "Can you write yours?" Daniel smiled and wrote, "Daniel Mackenzie." His handwriting was neat, the product of a good education. "Daniel is 6 letters, Mackenzie is 9, 15 letters total for my whole name." "That is a lot of letters," Sarah said, attempting to copy his name below her own. Her version was messier, the letters uneven and childlike, but she finished it and felt a surge of pride. "I wrote your name." "You did." There was something in his voice, something warm and pleased, and when Sarah looked up, their eyes met and held. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the slight curve of his mouth. He was handsome, she realized. She had been so focused on survival that she had not really looked at him before, but now she saw him. Young, strong, kind, and patient. And the way he was looking at her made her feel like she was something precious. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, and then Daniel cleared his throat and looked away. "We should get some sleep. We are going to try for those Mustangs tomorrow." They caught 3 horses the next day. The trap worked perfectly, the lead mare bringing her small band into the corral to drink, and Daniel was quick enough to trigger the gate rope before they could escape. The horses panicked, slamming against the rails, but the structure held. By sunset, the Mustangs had exhausted themselves and stood trembling, their coats dark with sweat. "Now comes the hard part," Daniel said, leaning against the corral. "We have to break them enough that they are rideable but not so broken that they lose their spirit. The army does not want completely tame horses. They want animals with some fire still in them." Over the next 5 days, Sarah watched Daniel work with a skill that bordered on artistry. He was patient and firm, never cruel, using a combination of persistence and gentleness to convince each horse that a saddle and rider were tolerable. Sarah helped where she could, learning as she went, and by the end of the week, they had 3 horses that would accept a rider without bucking. "We should get $75 to $100 for these at Fort Whipple," Daniel calculated. "Maybe more if the quartermaster is in a good mood. That is a good start." They drove the horses to the fort, which was located about 15 miles from Prescott, and Sarah experienced a moment of pure anxiety when the Army quartermaster began examining their stock. He was a weathered sergeant with a drooping mustache and suspicious eyes, and he checked teeth, hooves, and temperament with thorough efficiency. $75 for the 3, he announced finally. Not a penny more. It was less than Daniel had hoped, but it was $75 they had not had before. Sarah accepted the payment in gold coins and tucked them into the leather pouch she wore under her dress, feeling the reassuring weight against her skin. On the ride back, Daniel was already planning their next trip. "There is another herd further north, bigger. If we can catch 5 or 6 more horses and you keep bringing in money from the laundry and sewing, we might just make it." "Might," Sarah echoed. It was not a promise, just a possibility, but it was more hope than she had felt since standing over her father's grave. That night, when Daniel wrote out the entire alphabet for her and told her to copy it, Sarah worked with intense focus. The letters were becoming familiar now, like faces she was learning to recognize. A through Z, each one unique, each one a building block of meaning. I want to learn to write a sentence, she said when she had finished copying the alphabet. A real sentence, not just letters. Daniel considered. What sentence do you want to write? Sarah thought about it. My name is Sarah Hawkins. That is a sentence, right? That is a perfect sentence. Daniel wrote it out. My name is Sarah Hawkins. 7 words, 23 letters. Now you try. It took her 20 minutes and 3 attempts, but she wrote it. My name is Sarah Hawkins. The letters were wobbly and uncertain, but they were hers. She had written a sentence. She had made words. I did it, she whispered, staring at the paper. You did, Daniel agreed, and his hand came to rest on her shoulder, a warm, solid weight. You should be proud, Sarah. Some people go their whole lives without having the courage to learn something new. She looked up at him, and he was closer than she had realized, his face only inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his gray-green eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Her heart began to beat faster, a drumbeat in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Daniel, she said, and his name in her mouth felt like a secret. Sarah. His voice was rough, and his hand moved from her shoulder to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I should not. Should not what? She asked, and she knew she was being bold, knew she was crossing some invisible line, but she did not care. In the past 2 weeks, this man had become essential to her, not just for his labor but for his presence, his patience, his kindness. He had taught her letters, but he was teaching her something else too, that she was worthy of care, of attention, of gentleness. This, Daniel said, and then he kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, a question more than a declaration. Sarah had been kissed before, fumbling attempts by a boy at a barn dance when she was 17, but this was different. This was a man who kissed like he did everything else, with focus and care and a warmth that spread through her like whiskey. She kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart pounding as hard as her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. That was foolish of me, he said. I am sorry. I am supposed to be working for you, helping you save your ranch, not taking liberties. What if I wanted you to take liberties? Sarah asked, and she was surprised by her own boldness, by the hunger in her own voice. What if I have been thinking about you doing exactly that for the past week? Daniel groaned, a sound somewhere between agony and amusement. Sarah Hawkins, you are going to be the death of me. But he kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, and Sarah felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. They pulled apart only when the lamp began to sputter, running low on oil. Daniel stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. I should go to the barn. We both need sleep, and if I stay here any longer, I am going to do something ungentlemanly. Sarah did not want him to go. She wanted him to stay, wanted to explore this new territory they had stumbled into, but she also knew he was right. There was work to do, a deadline to meet, a ranch to save. Romance was a luxury they could not quite afford yet. Tomorrow, she said instead. We will catch more horses tomorrow. Tomorrow, Daniel agreed, and the look he gave her was full of promise. They caught 5 more horses over the next 10 days, working harder than Sarah had ever worked in her life. Her hands blistered and bled from the rope work. Her muscles screamed from long days in the saddle, and she fell into bed each night so exhausted that she barely had the energy to eat. But they were making progress. The tin can was filling with coins and bills, slowly but steadily. The writing lessons continued, and Sarah progressed from simple sentences to longer ones. Daniel brought her a book, a slim volume of poetry that had belonged to his mother, and began teaching her to read the printed words. It was harder than writing because the letters looked different in print, smaller and more uniform, but Sarah was determined. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, she read aloud one night, sounding out each word carefully. What kind of sentence is that? It is a sentence that uses every letter in the alphabet, Daniel explained. It is a practice sentence, not very poetic, but useful. I like poetry better, Sarah admitted. She had been fascinated by the poems in the book, even though she could only read a few words here and there. Will you read one to me? Daniel flipped through the pages and selected a poem. His voice, which was usually matter-of-fact and practical, softened as he read. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that is best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. The words washed over Sarah like music. That is beautiful. What does it mean? It means the poet saw a woman who was so lovely that she reminded him of a perfect night, full of stars. It is about beauty, but also about balance, dark and bright together. Daniel looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made Sarah's breath catch. It makes me think of you. You have that balance, strong but gentle, tough but kind. I am not beautiful, Sarah protested, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure. I am sunburned and my hands are calloused and my hair never stays where it should. You are beautiful to me, Daniel said simply. The most beautiful thing I have seen in a long time. They kissed again that night and the night after and the night after that. Their romance grew in the stolen moments between work, in the quiet evenings by lamplight, in the early mornings when they would stand together watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls. It was not a leisurely courtship with proper calls and chaperoned visits. It was a love born of necessity and proximity, but it was no less real for that. With 5 days left before the bank deadline, they made their second trip to Fort Whipple with 5 horses. The same sergeant examined them and offered $125 for the lot. Combined with the money from the first sale and everything Sarah had earned from laundry and sewing, they had $218. We did it, Sarah said that night, counting the money out on the table for the 3rd time just to be sure. We actually did it. We have enough to pay the bank with money left over. Daniel was grinning, his relief palpable. You did it, Sarah. This is your ranch, your fight. I just helped. We did it together, Sarah corrected, and then she was in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around the small cabin, both of them giddy with exhaustion and success. When he set her down, his expression turned serious. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Ask you something, her heart, which had been soaring, clenched with sudden anxiety. What is it? I have been thinking about what happens next, after you pay the bank, after the ranch is safe. I have been thinking about where I go from here. He took her hands in his thumb rubbing across her knuckles. I do not want to leave. These past few weeks, working beside you, teaching you letters, sitting with you every evening, it has been the happiest I have been in 5 years. Maybe the happiest I have ever been. I know I am just a drifter with nothing to my name, but if you would have me, I would like to stay. Not as hired help, but as your husband, if you will have me. Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. A proposal he was proposing. Daniel, are you sure? You barely know me. I know everything I need to know, he said firmly. I know you are strong and smart and determined. I know you work harder than any person I have ever met. I know you are kind to your animals and honest in your dealings and brave enough to learn something new even when it scares you. I know that when I look at you, I see my future, if you will give me one. So I am asking, Sarah Hawkins, will you marry me? The answer rose in her throat, immediate and certain. Yes, yes, Daniel, I will marry you. He kissed her then, a kiss full of joy and promise, and Sarah felt like her life was finally moving in the right direction. She had lost her father, nearly lost her ranch, had been drowning in despair just 3 weeks ago. And now she had a future. She had hope. She had love. They rode into Prescott the next morning with the money carefully secured and went straight to the Territorial Bank. The banker, a thin man with spectacles and an air of superiority, looked surprised to see them. Miss Hawkins, he said, glancing at the papers on his desk. I confess I did not expect to see you today. I assumed you would be unable to make the payment. Then you assumed wrong, Sarah said, and she took great satisfaction in counting out $150 in coins and bills onto his desk. That is the full amount owed, I believe. The banker counted the money twice, his expression souring when he realized it was all there. This brings your loan current, but you still owe a substantial sum on the principal. I am aware, Sarah said coolly, And I will continue to make the monthly payments as agreed. You will get your money, sir, just not my ranch." They left the bank with the paid receipt and the mortgage papers marked current, and Sarah felt 10 feet tall. On the boardwalk outside, Daniel caught her hand and squeezed it. "I am proud of you," he said. That took courage, walking in there and facing him down. "I had good motivation," Sarah replied, squeezing back. "Now, I believe we have a wedding to arrange." They were married 3 days later by the Justice of the Peace in Prescott, with the general store owner and his wife standing as witnesses. Sarah wore the only good dress she owned, a dark blue calico that Daniel said brought out her eyes, and Daniel wore a clean shirt and his best vest. The ceremony was brief and practical, but when Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and kissed her as the justice pronounced them man and wife, Sarah felt like a queen. The wedding night was spent in a small room at the boarding house, the first time Sarah had slept anywhere other than the ranch in months. Daniel was gentle and patient, and if Sarah was nervous, his tenderness soon eased her fears. They came together in the narrow bed with the moonlight streaming through the window, and Sarah discovered that physical love could be tender and intense and sweet all at once. "I love you," Daniel whispered against her hair afterward, holding her close. "I think I started loving you the first time you copied that letter, so determined and fierce." "I love you too," Sarah whispered back. "I think I started loving you when you offered to work for free to help a stranger, or maybe when you first put that pencil in my hand and told me I could learn." They returned to the ranch the next day as husband and wife, and life settled into a new rhythm. Daniel was no longer just a hired hand but a full partner, and together they began to rebuild and expand. They caught and sold more horses, slowly grew their cattle herd, and made improvements to the property. Sarah continued to take in laundry and sewing, but now it was to build savings rather than to stave off disaster. The writing lessons continued too, but now they were lessons in reading as much as writing. Daniel brought her books from town, simple ones at first and then gradually more complex, and Sarah devoured them with the hunger of someone who had been denied food for too long. She read novels and newspapers, agricultural guides and poetry. Each word she conquered was a small victory. Each page she completed was proof that she was more than the circumstances of her birth. One evening in late autumn, nearly 5 months after Daniel had first ridden up to the ranch, Sarah was attempting to read a newspaper article about territorial politics when she stumbled over a word. "Daniel, what is this word, constitution," he corrected gently. "It means the fundamental laws and principles that govern a nation or state. The United States Constitution is the document that lays out how our government works." Sarah sounded it out again, committing it to memory. "That is a complicated word." "It is," Daniel agreed, "but you rate it. 5 months ago, you could not write your own name. Now you are reading about constitutional law in the newspaper. That is remarkable, Sarah." She set the newspaper aside and looked at her husband, this man who had appeared in her life at her darkest moment and brought light. "I never thanked you properly for everything you did, everything you have done." "You do not need to thank me," Daniel said, pulling her into his arms. "You saved yourself, Sarah. You worked yourself to the bone for this ranch. I just helped a little." "You helped a lot," Sarah insisted. She tilted her head up to kiss him. "You taught me every letter, just like you promised. So I did." Daniel's expression turned thoughtful. "You know, I have been thinking. We have been doing well with the horses and the cattle, and we have some money saved. What would you say to expanding? Maybe buying some of that land to the east, the section with the good water source." They spent the evening planning, dreaming aloud about the future. More land, more cattle, maybe eventually hiring a hand or two of their own. Sarah suggested they might think about building a larger house, something with separate rooms and a real kitchen. Daniel wanted to build a better barn and add a chicken coop. "And someday, children," Sarah said softly. "I would like children." "Someday," Daniel agreed, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "When the time is right." The time became right sooner than they expected. By Christmas, Sarah knew she was carrying a child. She told Daniel on Christmas morning, after they had opened the few small gifts they had managed to buy for each other in town. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, and then a fierce protectiveness that made Sarah's eyes sting with tears. "A baby," he said, his hand gentle on her belly. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly anxious. A baby would mean more work, more responsibility, more mouths to feed. "Happy," Daniel pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, I am terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I can say. A family, a real family, that is more than I ever thought I would have." The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah was sick for the first 3 months, and the Arizona summer heat in 1879 was brutal. But she continued to work as much as she could, and Daniel picked up the slack without complaint. They hired a young man from town, a 17-year-old named Tommy who was eager to learn ranching, to help with the heavier work. Sarah spent the long, hot summer reading every book she could find about childbirth and infant care, sounding out the medical terms with increasing confidence. Her reading had improved to the point where she could tackle almost anything, though she still sometimes needed Daniel's help with particularly complex words. In September, when the worst of the heat had broken and the nights were turning cool, Sarah went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, with only Daniel and a midwife from town to help her through it. But when she finally heard the sharp, angry cry of her newborn son, she wept with relief and joy. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Sarah's chest. "A healthy boy." Daniel, who had been pacing anxiously outside the bedroom, came in and stared at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Sarah, he is perfect." They named him James, after Sarah's father, with the middle name Thomas after Daniel's father. Little James Mackenzie had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes, and from the beginning, he was strong and healthy and loud. Being new parents was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Sarah, who had never been around infants much, learned as she went, and Daniel proved to be surprisingly good with the baby despite his initial nervousness. They took turns walking James when he cried at night, took turns changing his diapers and singing him lullabies. The ranch continued to grow. They bought the eastern section of land that Daniel had wanted, giving them access to a year-round water source that dramatically increased their grazing capacity. The cattle herd grew to 50 head, then 75. They built a new barn and a chicken coop, and Sarah started a vegetable garden that flourished in the Arizona soil. On James's first birthday, Sarah pulled out a piece of paper and carefully wrote, "James Thomas Mackenzie, born September 15, 1879. First birthday September 15, 1880. She stared at the words, marveling at how far she had come. 2 years ago, she could not write her own name. Now she was recording her son's milestones in clear, confident script. "That is beautiful," Daniel said, looking over her shoulder. "Your handwriting has gotten so good, Sarah." "You should be proud." "I am," Sarah said softly. "Not just of the writing, but of all of it, the ranch, our family, our life. 2 years ago, I thought I had lost everything, and now look at us." Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they both watched their son, who was sitting on a blanket playing with wooden blocks that Daniel had carved. "You know what I think about sometimes? I think about how close I came to riding past this place. I almost went north to Flagstaff instead of south to Prescott. If I had made that choice, I never would have met you." "Fate," Sarah said. "It had to be fate." "Maybe," Daniel agreed, "or maybe just dumb luck. Either way, I am grateful for it every single day." They had 2 more children over the next 5 years. A daughter they named Elizabeth Grace in 1882, who had her father's charm and her mother's determination. And another son, Samuel Daniel, in 1884, who was quiet and thoughtful from the beginning. The ranch prospered. By 1885, they had 150 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and they had paid off the mortgage entirely. The small cabin had been expanded and improved until it was a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and even a parlor with real glass windows. They employed 3 ranch hands full-time and took on additional help during roundup season. Sarah had become known in the area not just as a successful rancher, but as a woman who could read and write beautifully. She began teaching other women in the area who had never learned letters, holding informal classes in her parlor on Sunday afternoons. She taught the ranch hands' children and the neighboring farmers' daughters. She even taught old Mrs. Henderson from the next ranch over, who was 65 years old and had always been ashamed of her inability to read. "You gave me a gift when you taught me letters," Sarah told Daniel one evening after her students had gone home. "I am just passing that gift along." Daniel, who was mending a bridle, smiled at her. "My mother would have loved you. She always said education was the greatest gift you could give someone." "I wish I could have met her," Sarah said. Daniel rarely spoke of his parents, both of whom had died before he left Missouri, but she knew he missed them. "She would have adored you," Daniel said with certainty. "And she would have been so proud of what you have accomplished, not just the ranch, but the reading, the teaching. You have built something important here, Sarah, something that will last." In the summer of 1886, when James was nearly 7 and already learning to rope and ride, Sarah realized she was pregnant again. She was 30 years old now, more confident and settled than she had ever been, but a 4th child still made her anxious. 4 children meant more mouths to feed, more clothes to mend, more futures to secure. But Daniel was delighted. "Our family keeps growing," he said, his hand on her belly. "I love it. The more the merrier." This pregnancy was easier than the previous ones, and in February of 1887, Sarah gave birth to twin girls. The midwife had not expected twins, and there was a moment of shocked surprise when the second baby arrived 10 minutes after the first. But both girls were healthy, if small, and they named them Rose and Ruby because Sarah said they were like 2 precious gems. With 5 children under the age of 8, life became chaotic. The house was always full of noise and activity, with children's laughter and arguments, toys scattered everywhere, and meals that required industrial quantities of food. Sarah sometimes felt like she was drowning in domesticity, but Daniel was an active father who changed diapers and told bedtime stories, and got up with crying babies just as often as she did. The children all learned to read and write at young ages, with Sarah insisting that her children would never experience the helplessness she had felt. James was a natural reader who devoured every book they owned. Elizabeth preferred writing, filling tablet after tablet with stories about adventures and far-off places. Samuel was slower but steady, methodical in his learning. And the twins, when they were old enough, proved to be bright and curious about everything. One evening in 1890, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table helping James with his arithmetic, when she realized that her 12-year-old son could read and calculate at a level she had only achieved a few years ago. The thought filled her with a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. "Something wrong, Ma?" James asked, noticing her expression. "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, ruffling his dark hair. "I am just proud of you. You are so smart, James. You can do anything you want with your life." "I want to be a rancher like you and Pa," James said simply. "I want to run this ranch someday." Sarah glanced toward the window, where she could see Daniel working in the barn with Tommy, who was now a full partner in the operation. The ranch that had nearly been taken from her 12 years ago was now thriving, worth many times what it had been. And her children would inherit it, would have opportunities she had never dreamed of. "Then you will be a rancher," Sarah said. "And you will be good at it because you can read contracts and keep books and write letters. You will never be helpless the way I was." "Tell me again," James said. "Tell me about when Pa came to the ranch and taught you to write." Sarah had told the story many times to all her children, but she never tired of it. "I was 22 years old," she began, "and my father had just died. I was alone on this ranch with a mortgage I could not pay and papers I could not read. I thought I was going to lose everything. And then your father rode up on his paint horse." She told the familiar story, watching James's rapt attention, and marveled at how much could change in a dozen years. The desperate, frightened girl she had been seemed like a stranger now. That Sarah had been unable to write her own name, had been at the mercy of a world she could not navigate. This Sarah ran a successful ranch, taught others to read, and was raising 5 literate, confident children. But she never forgot where she had started, and she never forgot the man who had stopped to help when he had no reason to, who had offered his labor for free and his knowledge without condescension. Daniel had given her more than letters. He had given her hope, love, partnership, and a future. That night, after all the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Sarah and Daniel sat on the porch watching the stars emerge over the canyon. It was their habit, this quiet time together at the end of the day, and Sarah treasured it. "You remember the first letter you taught me?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. Daniel said immediately. "You made me write it over and over until you could copy it perfectly. And then B, C, D, E." Sarah recited the letters like a catechism. 26 letters total, such a small thing, really, 26 symbols. "But they changed my whole life." "You changed your own life," Daniel corrected, as he always did. "The letters were just tools, you did the work." "We did the work," Sarah said, "together, just like we do everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Daniel said, "I have been thinking. James is getting old enough to take on more responsibility around the ranch, and with Tommy and the other hands, we have good help. What would you say to taking a trip? Maybe going to San Francisco, or even back to Missouri so you could see where I grew up." The idea was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Sarah had barely left the Arizona territory in her entire life. "Could we really?" "I do not see why not," Daniel said. "We have worked hard for 12 years. Maybe it is time we saw a bit of the world beyond this canyon." They did take that trip in the fall of 1890, leaving the ranch in James's capable hands with Tommy supervising. They took the train from Prescott to San Francisco, and Sarah pressed her face to the window like a child, marveling at the changing landscape. She had read about trains and cities and oceans, but seeing them in person was entirely different. San Francisco was overwhelming. So many people, so many buildings, such noise and bustle and energy. Daniel held her hand as they explored the city, visiting museums and restaurants and theaters. Sarah bought books in a massive bookstore with shelves that reached the ceiling, and she stood there crying with joy at the sheer abundance of written words. "I never thought I would see something like this," she told Daniel. "All these books, all this knowledge, and I can read any of them." They went to the theater and saw a play, which Sarah found magical despite her initial confusion about the stagecraft. They ate in restaurants where white-clothed tables and multiple forks intimidated her, until Daniel quietly showed her which fork to use for what. They walked along the ocean, and Sarah tasted salt water for the first time, but what moved her most was visiting a public library. Daniel took her to the San Francisco Public Library, a grand building with marble floors and hushed reverence, and Sarah walked through the stacks with tears streaming down her face. All these books, free for anyone to read. All this knowledge, available to anyone who could master those 26 letters. "I wish every person could see this," she whispered. "I wish everyone who thinks they are too old or too ignorant to learn could stand here and see what is possible." When they returned to the ranch 3 weeks later, Sarah was brimming with ideas. She wanted to start a proper school in the area, wanted to bring in a real teacher, wanted to create a library that her neighbors could use. She wanted to give others the opportunities she had fought so hard to gain. Over the next few years, she worked toward those goals. With Daniel's support and the financial stability their successful ranch provided, Sarah helped establish a school in the nearest town. She donated money for books and supplies, and she continued to teach adult literacy classes in her home. The school was named Hawkins School, and Sarah attended the dedication ceremony with her entire family, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and family milestones. James grew into a strong, capable young man who eventually married a schoolteacher named Annie and brought her to live on the ranch. Elizabeth, true to her childhood dreams, moved to Flagstaff and became a journalist, writing articles for the local newspaper. Samuel studied agriculture and brought new, modern techniques back to the ranch that increased their productivity. The twins, Rose and Ruby, were inseparable, and both became teachers, taking positions at the school their mother had helped establish. Sarah and Daniel grew older together, their hair turning gray, their hands growing more gnarled with arthritis, but their love never diminished. They still sat on the porch every evening, still held hands, still talked about everything and nothing. They became grandparents, delighting in James and Annie's 3 children and later in grandchildren from their other children. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, Daniel gave Sarah a gift, a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover in gold letters. Sarah Mackenzie. "For your thoughts," he said, "for the stories you want to tell, for whatever you want to write." Sarah opened the journal to the first pristine page, picked up a pen and wrote, "My name is Sarah Mackenzie. I am 46 years old. 26 years ago, I could not write my own name. Today, I can write anything." She filled that journal and many others over the years, recording her life, her thoughts, her memories. She wrote about the ranch, about her children and grandchildren, about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She wrote about fear and courage, about love and loss, about the transforming power of education and the importance of helping others. And she always came back to that pivotal moment in 1878, when a young cowboy had ridden up to her ranch and offered his help. The moment when Daniel had sat down with her, placed a pencil in her hand and said, "I will teach you every letter." That promise had changed everything. It had saved her ranch, yes, but more importantly, it had saved her. It had given her agency and dignity and power. It had opened up a world that had been closed to her, and it had brought her the love of her life. Sarah was 63 years old, a grandmother many times over when Daniel fell ill. It started with a cough that would not go away, and despite Sarah's attempts to nurse him back to health with every remedy she knew, he grew steadily weaker. The doctor came from Prescott and spoke kindly but honestly. There was nothing to be done. Daniel's lungs were failing. Sarah moved a chair into their bedroom and rarely left his side during those last weeks. Their children came to visit, bringing the grandchildren, and Daniel smiled to see his family gathered around him. But mostly, it was just Sarah and Daniel, holding hands, talking quietly, remembering. "I do not regret a single day," Daniel told her one evening when his breathing was particularly labored. "Not one day since I rode up to that ranch and saw you trying to fix that fence all alone. That was the luckiest day of my life." "Mine too," Sarah whispered, her throat tight with tears. "I never learned to write my own name, and you taught me every letter. You taught me so much more than letters, Daniel. You taught me that I was worth something, that I could do anything." "You always could," Daniel said weakly. "I just helped you see it." He died on a cool October evening in 1911, with Sarah holding his hand and his children gathered around his bed. He was 60 years old, and he slipped away peacefully as the sun set over the canyon, painting the rocks the same colors they had been the first time Sarah saw him riding up the trail. Sarah grieved deeply, but she did not break. She had learned too much about resilience, about continuing when things were hard, about moving forward even when your heart was shattered. She ran the ranch with James's help, continued to teach reading to anyone who asked, and spent time with her growing family. She lived another 15 years, watching her grandchildren grow and eventually welcoming great-grandchildren. She saw automobiles become common, saw Arizona become a state in 1912, saw women gain the right to vote. The world changed dramatically in her lifetime, but some things remained constant. The red canyon walls, the cattle grazing in the valley, the ranch that she and Daniel had built together. On her 78th birthday in 1926, surrounded by 4 generations of her family, Sarah sat at the head of a long table laden with food and laughter. Her hands shook with age as she cut her birthday cake, but her mind was still sharp, her memories vivid. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and she was alone with her thoughts, Sarah pulled out one of her journals and made a final entry. Her handwriting was shakier now, the letters less perfect than they had been in her prime, but they were still clear and legible. "I am an old woman now," she wrote, "but I was once a young woman who could not write her own name. I was once desperate and frightened and alone. And then a cowboy rode into my life and offered to teach me every letter. He gave me literacy, love, family, and a future. He gave me myself. I have lived a good life, a full life, a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I was 22 years old standing over my father's grave. If I have learned anything, it is this. It is never too late to learn, never too late to change, never too late to become who you are meant to be. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is the simple act of teaching them something new, of showing them they are capable of more than they knew. Daniel taught me my letters, and in doing so, he taught me hope. That is what I want my legacy to be, hope and literacy and love." Sarah Mackenzie died peacefully in her sleep 2 months later, in January of 1927. She was buried next to Daniel on the hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and dates. But their real legacy was all around. In the successful ranch that their descendants continued to operate, in the school that bore their name, in the hundreds of people that Sarah had taught to read over the years, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all knew how to read and write and calculate and dream. The story of the illiterate rancher and the cowboy who taught her letters became family legend, passed down through generations. Great-grandchildren who had never met Sarah or Daniel still knew about the pencil and paper on the kitchen table, about the patient lessons by lamplight, about 26 letters that changed 2 lives and created a family. The ranch still stands today, smaller than it was in its heyday but still operational, still owned by Mackenzie descendants. And in the main house, preserved under glass, is a piece of yellowed paper with uneven, childish letters that spell out, "My name is Sarah Hawkins." The first sentence Sarah ever wrote, saved by Daniel and treasured by their children and kept as a reminder of where they came from. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing in the world is not guns or gold or land. Sometimes the most powerful thing is simple knowledge, the ability to write your own name, to read your own contracts, to tell your own story. And sometimes the most powerful love is the one that begins with someone saying, "I will teach you, I will help you. I will stay with you until you can do it yourself." Sarah could not write her own name when Daniel Mackenzie rode into her life on that hot day in 1878. But by the time she died, nearly 50 years later, she had written thousands of pages, letters, stories, journals, lessons, and lists. She had written her name so many times it became second nature. She had written her life into existence, word by word, letter by letter, and it all started with a cowboy who kept his promise. "Then I will teach you every letter."